Welcome to this forum, this public forum by the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. My name is Cheryl Zur, and I'm one of the co-chairs. I apologize, I have a cold, but I'm able to speak better today than I was yesterday, so I'm glad about that. This is the first of 3 forums on the history of Zionism. The second and third forums will be held, the next one will be next Sunday, the 21st, and then there will be one on Sunday, February 5th. And, if you signed up for this forum, you've seen the notice for those as well. If you are here today, you are automatically registered for all the other 2 forums. We have to work out the details about other people, but I believe you can share the registration link, correct, John, with other people?
I
No?
changed it back. You're going to have to re-register again for the future forums.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. In any case, all of our forums are recorded and they will be posted on our YouTube channel, generally along with the transcript. We have 2 back-to-back presentations today, each of them about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. There won't be a break in between the presentations. Afterwards, there will be about 30 to 45 minutes of comments and questions. The presenters will only come back into the discussion as necessary to answer very direct questions. During the discussion, participants will have 3 minutes to speak. At the end of the discussion period, John and Rick will be given 5 to 8 minutes to make any concluding comments. If there's an interest in continuing the discussion after the meeting has formally ended, the recording is ended, we can certainly continue, keep the Zoom link open. As I said, we are the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. And some people have said, why are you having a forum on Palestine and the history of Zionism? What does that have to do with Ukraine? If you're here today, you already understand the parallels between the Ukrainian people's war against Russian imperialism and the struggles in Palestine have a lot in common. And so the lessons of the struggle in Palestine can be applied to many struggles against colonialism. We have to understand the past in order to understand the present, and then take those lessons to determine an independent course of action to build a movement that can end the barbarism that we're seeing today around the world. So with that, I'm going to call on John, and thank you for coming.
So, first of all, I would like to thank Megan and Cheryl and Rick for help in my presentation. And I'm going to do it as a screen share. A few weeks ago, Israeli columnist Amira Haas wrote a column in the Israeli daily paper Haaretz, in which she asked, quote, "What enables the majority of Jewish Israelis to support this systematic and mass erasure of the people of Gaza? What enables the majority of Jewish Israelis to remain unshocked by the fact that in about 2 months, we've killed around 7,000 children with the help of America's improved bombs?" End of quote. To answer that question, we have to go back to the early history of Zionism, which in its earliest origins created a system of European Jewish supremacy and sowed deep divisions in the working class of Palestine, and in essence, labeled the Palestinians as others. I'm going to discuss the history of Zionism, and especially what was called labor Zionism, through a socialist lens. This history not only laid the roots for Israel today, it also holds the lessons for present-day movements elsewhere, including the issue of identity politics. We will also see how global events played themselves out in Palestine. That includes global revolution, the Russian Revolution, and counter-revolution, the rise of the Nazis. Now, by the end of World War I, a youngish Hungarian-born bourgeois Jew, Theodor Herzl, had established the Zionist movement. Herzl believed that Gentile, that is, non-Jewish society, was inevitably anti-Semitic, and that the answer was for Jews to create their own homeland. In practice, that meant that all Jews, capitalists, small business people, and workers alike were united. Today, Zionists claim Israel-Palestine is theirs based on the word of God. But at one point, Herzl considered the idea of a Jewish homeland in South America. Ultimately, he settled on Palestine as the Jewish homeland, but more specifically, a homeland for European Jews. Originally, the Jewish homeland was conceived as being under Ottoman rule, and then, after World War I, under British rule. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the British imperialists declared Palestine as a Jewish homeland in the political sense. British imperialism saw an increased Jewish population in Palestine as being a population base through which they could rule, just like they used or got some support from the Protestants in Ulster and Northern Ireland to rule in Ireland. In fact, the first British military governor of Palestine, Sir Ronald Storrs, put it very clearly. He saw the potential for a growing Jewish population in Palestine to be, quote, our loyal little Jewish Ulster, end quote. Now, another wing of Zionism, other than that led by Herzl, that developed in the post-World War I era, was Zionist revisionism, led by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky called for an independent Jewish state in Palestine. He ended up as an outright fascist whose supporters paraded around in Nazi-like brown shirt uniforms. And he was quite clear. Jabotinsky wrote that, quote, Zionism is a colonizing adventure and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force, end quote. During the Russian Civil War following the 1917 revolution, Jabotinsky offered to collaborate with the Ukrainian counter-revolutionary general Simon Petlura of Cossack heritage. Jabotinsky offered his forces to patrol any Jewish regions that Petlura's army conquered. Petlura's army had led anti-Jewish pogroms in Ukraine that slaughtered some 30,000 Jews from 1917 to 1920. About 60,000 Jews were killed in pogroms in Ukraine during those years overall. Jabotinsky's offer to collaborate with Petlura created such a scandal within the World Zionist Organization that Jabotinsky actually withdrew from it rather than be investigated. We will see where his so-called Zionist revisionism forces led in a later period. Jabotinsky's traitorous role towards the Ukrainian Jews was not unique in Zionism, but to the end, today he was highly revered as a figure in Israel. Now let us skip here to the situation for the Jewish people between World War I and World War II. At that time, the Jews were scattered throughout Europe, America, and Southwest Asia and North Africa, with the majority being in Eastern Europe, especially Poland and Russia. The Jews did not live in one contiguous landmass. They spoke different languages, ate different foods, and in essence had different cultures. In other words, the Jews were not a people nation in the same sense that the Kurds or the Uyghurs are today. As far as Palestine being their so-called homeland, any Jews who were not living within Palestine had had their links with that part of the world broken thousands of years earlier. Therefore, the Zionist project did not correspond to the material conditions of Europe's Jews, and as a result, Zionism was just a fringe movement among those Jews. As with all other peoples, the Jews were divided by class. The working class majority followed another political tendency, social democracy. It was the Jewish Bund, a Jewish social democratic party that the majority of Europe's Jews supported. As social democrats, the Bund had a class-based analysis. They saw society as basically divided up between capitalists and workers, whereas Zionists saw all Jews, workers and capitalists alike, as being united. And in every single nationalist movement that seeks to unite workers and capitalists, the capitalists dominate and control the movement. That is exactly what's happened with Zionism. Now, let's turn to what was happening in Palestine in those early years. It's important to stress that there had been Jews in all of the region long before Zionism arose, and contrary to what we've been told, there were no major conflicts between the Jews and the Arabs during that whole period. Also at that time, the particular experiences that molded the Arab majority into Palestinians was just beginning. So they themselves referred to themselves as Arabs rather than Palestinians. In Palestine, the Arab majority was called fellahin, rural small farmers, who either worked their own small plots of land or worked for a large landowner. The issue of Jewish settlers steadily encroaching on the Arab land was a huge issue. However, for reasons of time, I won't be able to deal with that issue. Instead, I'm going to focus on developments within the working class, within amongst wage workers. That's because I believe that under capitalism, it is the working class that is the key force for change. And that was reflected in the fact that a dominant Zionist force in Palestine was so-called labor Zionism, as we will see. In Palestine under British rule, the Zionist project faced a problem because to have a Jewish homeland settled by Jews from Europe, and Zionism was a European-based project, it must attract Jewish workers from Europe. And to attract those Jewish workers, it was necessary for them to have a standard of living that was above what workers in the Arab world had at that time. But no capitalist, British, Arab, Jewish, or anybody else, is going to offer pay above what they have to. And the extremely low wages that they could get away with paying Arab workers served to drag down the pay of Jewish workers also, which meant it was nearly impossible to attract Jewish workers from Europe. So the Zionists had two different strategies to deal with that. One was to establish what amounted to two different economies, one low value and low pay economy for the Arab workers, and a higher value and higher pay economy for Jewish workers. That was a form of economic apartheid. The other strategy was at times to help Arab workers raise their pay in order to raise the floor for all workers, Jewish and Arab alike. For this, some form of unionism was needed, and that was the basis for what was known as labor Zionism. But the very term labor Zionism is inherently contradictory. That's because the labor movement necessarily means uniting all of labor, all workers, regardless of race, gender, nationality, etc. While on the other hand, Zionism was an explicitly Jewish project aimed at building a Jewish homeland at the expense of non-Jews, meaning Arabs. In the workplace, it meant building a Jewish workforce that often necessarily involved replacing Arab workers with Jewish workers. So it was impossible for Zionists to build a real labor movement, to build real unionism. And that was the contradiction that labor Zionism represented. It was an absolutely essential ingredient to the Zionist project, which absolutely had to betray real worker solidarity. Backed by the British imperialists, the labor Zionists had a lot of influence and power with the Jews coming from Europe. In 1920, the labor Zionists held a founding conference of the Histadrut. The Histadrut was a so-called union federation, basically an alliance of various workers' unions. The Histadrut's full name was the General Organization of Hebrew Workers in the Land of Israel, and they meant Hebrew workers exclusively. There were struggles around Arab exclusion, but it was not until 1959 that the Histadrut accepted Arab, which is to say Palestinian workers, as full members. In other words, the Histadrut literally was a form of apartheid or Jim Crow unionism, which means it wasn't really unionism at all. At times, the Histadrut did organize Arab workers, but as we will see, that always did so under the control of the European Jewish supremacist Histadrut leadership. As a result of the role of labor Zionism, to this very day, the Israeli working class has a very weak tradition of genuine unionism and solidarity between Jewish and Palestinian workers. This helps explain in part the enormous divide between today's Palestinian and Jewish workers and the low level of class consciousness. David Ben-Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister and was labor Zionism personified, said that the creation of a labor front was, quote, the mission of the Jewish workers, end quote, not the common task of both groups, just the Jewish workers. Let's take a second to absorb this quote from Ben-Gurion, which shows what labor Zionism really meant. The Histadrut did at times organize Arab workers to struggle for better pay, but what they did not do, and what they always opposed, was the self-organizing of the Arab workers themselves. While labor Zionist leaders saw raising the wages of the Arab workers as being in the interest of the Zionist project, they also saw all Arab organizing as a threat to the Zionist project. In part, Arab self-organizing was a threat because it went against the Histadrut's organized effort to replace Arab workers with Jewish workers. Also, in part, it was a threat because it risked fomenting Arab nationalism, which Zionism opposed. The Histadrut also operated as a capitalist employment agency. It was directly involved in setting up some of the kibbutzim, or farms. These were farms owned by the Jewish Agency, a capitalist entity formerly known as the World Zionist Congress. The Histadrut also set up a Jewish construction employment agency to hire Jewish construction workers in the building of a deep water port in Haifa. Now, not all Jewish workers were totally and hopelessly racist. There were a couple of political parties that expressed a drive for unity, but both of these parties tried to square the circle. They tried to align Zionism, the creation of a specifically Jewish homeland, with working class unity. The only working class party in Palestine that unequivocally rejected Zionism and tried to help Arab workers organize was the Palestine Communist Party, which belonged to the Third International. The Palestine Communist Party, in part, owed its existence to the revolutionary wave that swept the world working class, following the 1917 Russian Revolution. But the Palestine Communist Party had to swim against every single other political tendency in Palestine. And also, by the early 1920s, that revolutionary wave, which followed the Russian Revolution, was receding, and in my opinion, this also weakened the Palestine Communist Party. So now, as I begin to wrap up, let's look at how these dynamics played out in the railway industry, which was very important in Palestine. At that time, the Histadrut founded the Railway Workers Association, a railway union, in 1919. Although this union belonged to the Histadrut, it also directly recruited Arab railway workers as full members, and therein lay the contradiction. The Arab workers reacted to the fact that the Histadrut, the parent body, only accepted Jewish members. So while some Arab railway workers did join the union, the apartheid position of the Histadrut was a barrier to major recruitment into the railway union. In the 1920s, there was a struggle within the Railway Workers Association for it to leave the Histadrut. Only the Palestine Communist Party advocated that position. This was an uphill battle, partly because the Histadrut played a major role in financing the Railway Workers Union. The Histadrut leadership ultimately expelled the communists and then got them fired from the railways. For obvious reasons, the Arab railway workers distrusted the labor Zionist leadership of the union. As a result, they then came under the influence of Arab middle-class nationalists and formed a railroad workers union exclusively for Arab workers, the Palestine Arab Workers Society, or PAWS, P-A-W-S. Ultimately, this proved to be no solution either. In order to counter the PAWS, the Histadrut set up an organizing effort for Arab workers called the Palestine Labor League, and the PLL, and through the PLL, they partly succeeded in undermining any organizing of Palestinian workers outside of their sphere of influence, the Histadrut sphere of influence, such as the Palestine Arab Workers Society, which was under the influence of the middle-class nationalists. During this entire period, there were efforts at class solidarity by Jewish workers in one place after another, for example, among Haifa Jewish port workers, but without a central organization. These efforts were defeated time and again by the Histadrut. And even if they had had essential leadership, the balance of forces by that time was against them. One final example of the racist role of labor Zionism and the Histadrut in decimating the working class consciousness in Palestine is that of the construction and then operation of the Nesher cement plant, which still exists to this day. The plant was constructed from 1922 to 24. The Histadrut succeeded in getting the construction crew to be all Jewish. When the plant opened in 1925, they employed only Jewish workers, but the quarry that supplied raw material employed both Jewish and Egyptian Arab workers. The Histadrut tried and ultimately succeeded in getting that crew to be all Jewish, getting the Arab workers to be fired. Now here, global counter-revolution played a decisive role in Zionism taking a hold. In February of 1932, Hitler came to power in Germany. This resulted in a massive increase of Jewish immigration into Palestine. In 1931, 4,000 Jews immigrated into Palestine. In 1935 alone, that number swelled to 62,000 Jewish immigrants. There followed an economic boom in Palestine. The Histadrut campaign for the replacement of Arab workers at the ports, in agriculture, and in construction. In all those industries, those campaigns included picketing work sites and even physical assaults on Arab workers. The legacies of labor Zionism, and the Histadrut in particular, are nothing but European Jewish supremacist apartheid and intentional misuse of the term labor and unionism. In conclusion, to sum up and stress my main points once again: 1, the Jewish people were not a national minority, and consequently, Zionism never had a mass base among European Jews prior to the rise of Hitler. Second, in placing Jewish workers under the control of Jewish capitalists, Zionism always was a reactionary and pro-imperialist movement. Third, Zionism both represented and relied upon British imperialism in this period. Fourth, in Palestine, Zionism completely perverted and undermined any true working class solidarity. And fifth, in doing so, Zionism created deep, deep divisions between the Arab and Jewish working class. And this devastated class consciousness at that time and continues to do so to this very day.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you very much, John. So Rick, you are muted, and anybody else who's not muted, I will mute you if yeah, it looks like everybody else is muted. Rick, do you want me to give you a time notice? And if so, at what point?
At 15 minutes, please.
Okay, go ahead.
You want me to just start?
Yes, yes.
Okay. My presentation basically is about the struggle by Palestinians against Zionism. But before I begin talking about that, I wanted to give people a picture of Palestinian society in 1920. Consider yourselves for a moment time travelers. You're dropped into Jaffa, the old city next to the new Zionist city of Tel Aviv, which means the spring. You would have found a working class of 25,000 Palestinians. The majority of Palestinians worked in agriculture as landless farm laborers. The majority of farmers were essentially sharecroppers. Palestinian society was divided into three main groups, class groups, semi-class groups. The urban elite, their clan was divided amongst families that took up various roles in Ottoman society, and those roles continued under the British Mandate until they didn't. Then there was the clans around agriculture, and finally the Bedouins. Now they all play a role as events unfold in the struggle of Palestinians against British imperialism and political Zionist settler colonialism. And that's what we're going to focus our attention on. So in 1920, the British Mandate comes into existence. Formally, actually, in 1923, after it's rubber stamped by the League of Nations. So between 1920 and 1929, there were constant battles going on between Palestinians and settler colonialists, Jews. Principally, the biggest events during this period were the 1921 May Day demonstrations, in which Zionists held a segregated march, and Palestinians in the old city of Jaffa in the intercommunal neighborhoods held a intercommunal May Day demonstration. Well, they met and they clashed, and that started a battle, really a series of intercommunal battles in which probably around 130 people were killed, that went on for 6 solid days and were finally brutally put down by the British police forces and some soldiers. Of course, the Palestinians were put in jail. The Zionists were set free. In 22, in 24, in 25, and in 27, there were constant demonstrations by Palestinians against Zionism. They were all led by the urban elite. The urban elite essentially clamped down the discontent of the Palestinian people against both British imperialism and the Zionist settler colonialist. Their view was that they could reason with British imperialism to change their minds, to see that the Palestinian people should also be given independence, and that the Jewish supremacists should not be given Palestine. Initially, they wrote the British High Command, the High Commissioner, who was an ardent Zionist, and in a 43-page letter that the British just laughed at and threw away. They ignored them. Still, the urban elite maintained that they could reason with the British, that the British would see their way clear, that their position was wrong. This came to its first head in 1929. Under the Ottomans, Jews were allowed to pray at what Jews call the Wailing Wall and what Arabs call El-Barak, which is the wall underneath the Dome of the Rock. And the rule in Ottoman society was that Jews could pray at the Wailing Wall, but they could not sit in chairs or on benches. The Zionists understood this, and they intentionally provoked the Palestinians by bringing benches and chairs. The Palestinians went to the British and said the rule should continue that existed under the Ottomans. The British agreed, and they removed the chairs and the benches. But the Zionists wanted to provoke an assault by the Palestinians. So they brought back the benches and the chairs, and that touched off a violent series of demonstrations that lasted for 2 weeks. Again, they were led by the Mufti, which translates to Arab scholar. is like the head religious leader of Palestinian society, who came from one of these elite families in the urban elite clan. So they directed, the Mufti and the urban elite directed the attack, the assault, on a religious basis, not on a nationalist basis. Eventually, again, the British came in, this time with Jewish thugs, and they defeated the Palestinian forces, and everything, quote unquote, went back to normal. Now, what is occurring in a parallel way to all these demonstrations is the increasing Zionist Jewish immigration to Palestine, which John touched upon. And I want to give you some important facts here. In 1919, the Jewish population was 66,000, approximately 10% of the total population of Palestine. In 1929, it had more than doubled to 156,000. By 1939, the settler population in Palestine was 370,000. Now, all these Zionist Jews flooding into Palestine would go and buy land. Land purchase was the major goal of Zionism, besides the labor Zionism that John spoke to in his presentation. The major owners of land were the urban elite. They began to sell their land to the Jews. The Jews would create kibbutzim, which were segregated. In turn, the sharecropping farmers were dispossessed of their land. Thousands and thousands of them were dispossessed. They were not employed by the Jews even in the moshavs, the cooperatives. So they drifted into the cities, into the urban slums that they created in Jaffa, the old city, in Jerusalem, and in all the other towns and cities that in 1948 the Zionists obliterated, erased off the map, but couldn't erase from memory. To where Palestinians would not sell land to Jews, the British imperialists came in and expropriated, claiming that they needed it for their military facilities. They would then turn around and give the land to the Jewish agency. Now, by 1936, between what the Israelis had purchased, what the Zionists had purchased, and what the British imperialists had seized, amounted to 1/3 of all the arable land in Palestine. That's 16 years. Imagine yourself a Palestinian, and everything in your society is being taken away from you. You're being dispossessed on a mass basis. How would you feel? Well, I know how I'd feel, and I know how you would feel. And in reading the history, we learned how Palestinians felt. There was, in the rural areas, already in the 30s, massive discontent. In 1933, there were mass demonstrations in every village and town throughout Palestine, registering the mass discontent of the people. There were guerrilla bands that formed, and they were led in particular by a man named Aziz Al-Qassam. And today we hear, for an example, the Qassam Brigade. Qassam was a legendary guerrilla leader and Palestinian religious leader who was a man among the people. He led a very successful guerrilla band. But the British in 1935 murdered him. There was a massive funeral for him in Haifa. It grew crowds of close to 5,000 people. In 1930, I'm sorry, at the end of 35, now we're toward the beginning of 1936. And we're in April. And the people's discontent was so great, and they were so upset about Qassam's murder by the British that a call went out from the bottom for a general strike. It was immediately met with overwhelming support from the Palestinian people. The urban elite was completely caught off guard. The British imperialists didn't know what was happening. The Zionists didn't know what was happening. Nobody expected this to happen. In a very short period of time, every merchant shop closed down. Palestinian society came to a standstill. The port of Jaffa, which was the main port, went silent. The truck drivers that carried goods throughout the country stopped working. The small artisan shops closed their doors. The public workers, 4,000, the largest portion of the Palestinian working class, put their tools down. Everything stopped. The urban elite tried to take leadership. They formed the Arab High Commission. The British ignored it. The Zionists ignored it. The people ignored it. The strike went on for 176 days, the general strike, the longest general strike in modern history, globally. It also touched off what has come to be called the Great Palestinian Revolt of 1936 to 1939. The general strike was, as I said, very successful in most of Palestine, with one significant exception, and that is in Haifa, amongst the Zionist Palestinian Labor League, run by a Palestinian collaborator who was a labor contractor. The Palestinians in Haifa wanted to go out on strike, but they were told that if they did, they would be replaced by Jews. So they didn't want to lose their work. They wouldn't be recompensed. So they stayed on the job. Eventually, under massive pressure, they finally went out with the general strike.
Rick, that's 15 minutes.
Thank you. The British, I'm going to go over the time. The British ruthlessly put down the general strike, crushed it. Thereafter, the movement went silent until 1938 in the early spring, when an armed struggle broke out publicly in the hills of eastern Palestine and in the villages led by the landless agricultural workers who were formerly sharecroppers. They basically took control through 1937 and 1938 of the entire eastern half of Palestine. They were met with ruthless brutality by the British and by Zionist gangs, including the Haganah, which was formed in 1920 by Jabotinsky. And what then happened is that the Palestinians by now realized that they had to expand their struggle. They opened their own mobile banks, their own mobile clinics, their own postal service. They became completely self-reliant against the British and the Zionists. Eventually, the British met the revolt with 100,000 British troops in 1939, including the British Air Force and the British Navy, to put down this revolt. That's how profound it was. During this period, at the end of the revolt, 5,000 Palestinians had been dead, thousands more imprisoned. Hundreds had been exiled. The Arab High Commission itself had been deported to the Seychelles Islands. Then World War II started. In spite of having been brutalized by the British, the Palestinians joined the fight against fascism in a Palestinian brigade under British rule. What did the Zionists do? Did they try to save a single Jew? No. They solidified their own movement. Meanwhile, in Arab countries under the control of the Nazis, only 1% of the indigenous Jewish population of Arab countries were lost. I think that's extremely important, very profound, because it speaks to the Zionist lie about anti-Semitism among the non-Jews population. We come now to the upshot of the 1936-39 revolt was that the British set up a commission. And the commission determined that they were withdrawing the mandate. So in a sense, the revolt was a temporary victory, because the Zionists were not going to get a state midwifed by the British. The Zionists understood this. They understood their position. And what did they do? They found their new ally, one that they had been working with since the 19-teens, the United States. And they began intensely lobbying the United States government, even during World War II, to become their patron. The United States was emerging now as the leading power in the world, and would, at the end of World War II, as we all know, become the sole superpower on Earth. After the end of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust became known to people, the Zionists opportunistically decided that the Holocaust was their private property, which we see played out again and again and again today. The United Nations was formed, and in 46 and 47, a debate carried on in the new United Nations about whether or not there should be a partition of Palestine. Eventually, a partition plan was drawn up, which the Palestinians summarily rejected, and rightly so. The Zionists said, we accept. At this very same time, from 46, the Zionists, who were much stronger now, who were getting arms from the United States illegally. The British had an embargo in place. Of course, the embargo was really just for the Palestinians, not for the Zionists. So the Zionists were extensively armed with US surplus military equipment and arms, and they began to use those arms against the Palestinian population. The Haganah, the defense force, the Irgun, a terrorist organization, and the Stern Gang, who were outright fascist, began to routinely and systematically later attack villages, assassinate Palestinians in broad daylight, and up their terror campaign. When the partition vote came, incredibly, the former USSR under Stalin voted for partition, a crime against humanity by itself. The Zionists ignored the partition. They decided they wanted everything. After all, that had been their goal from 1895 forward. There's a quote from David Ben-Gurion. The essence is that for us, a Jewish state is from the Nile to the Euphrates. And so the Zionists, through a massive terror campaign, drove out the Palestinians from their own homes in Jaffa. And this is very important because it's very illustrative of the terror campaign. The Zionists set up snipers. When people would go, when women would try to go shopping to the market, they were murdered. Their children were murdered. People couldn't go outside. They couldn't buy food. The Zionists would go into the villages. The most famous is Der Yashin, where the Irgun went in and slaughtered every man, woman, and child, and then broadcast it. So the Palestinians left. So they left. Did they voluntarily go? No. They were forcibly ethnically cleansed out of Palestine by all these forces of the new Zionist state. Israel was declared an independent state, I believe it's May 15th, 1948. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians did not stop in 1948. It continued until 1950, when an additional 250,000 Palestinians were also ethnically cleansed from the new Israeli state. And that's where I will stop.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Rick. Hold on a second here. Okay. Thanks to John and Rick for those tremendous presentations. Go ahead and open up the queue for comments and questions. Rachel had posted a question in the chat that either of you could address, since nobody's raised their hand yet. What was the Soviet response to the Palestine labor movement, and how did they reconcile rhetorical support for global worker solidarity, i.e. including Palestinian workers, with that of the Zionist project? That's a really good question. Do either of you want to try to answer that, since nobody's raised their hand yet to speak?
You want us to answer now, or?
Well, okay. Well, no, just I want you to be aware of the question. So, yeah, the floor is open for comments and questions. Nina, go ahead.
I have maybe simple question. I've been talking to some Ukrainians, and they're very pro-Israel in the present situation, Ukrainians in Ukraine, and also I think in diaspora. And so one of them said to me, because I know very little about Zionist history, but that if one shouldn't object to whatever Israel is doing because they bought the land. And today I hear, because I thought, what, they bought the land? No, it was given to them by the British. But now you're saying, yes, in fact, some of the land was bought. So I imagine it was a very small percentage. What do you know what the actual percentage of land that was, given to, not given, but was acquired by the Zionists, was acquired by buying, as opposed to the British mandate pardon?
You want me to answer that, Cheryl?
Sure, if you can answer it quickly. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. 1,250,000, we'll call them acres, although the Palestinian name is dunams, and I couldn't find what a dunam was. Maybe Offer knows.
Okay.
So it's not clear to me, like what percentage of land area, approximately, of course, was bought and what percentage was, given by the mandate?
The Zionists had 35% of the 35 to 40% of the land at the point of partition. The Palestinians had the rest.
So this 35% had been bought?
No. That was the total. 35 to 40% was the total. I don't know the total amount purchased. The last number I had for that was 1,250,000 dunams.
One acre is 4 dunams. Sorry.
What Offer?
Sorry, there was a bunch of background.
Sorry, I just want to say 1 acre is 4 dunams. You asked me about it.
Okay, 1 acre, 4 dunams.
Okay.
300,000 acres, approximately, were purchased.
So I'm assuming that's a small percentage, like 10% or less?
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next speaker. Nina, maybe we can circle back to this later in the discussion. Maybe other people will comment on it.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to call on Rachel. She wasn't sure how to raise her hand, and then I'll call on Talmadge and Ted. Go ahead, Rachel, wherever you are. Rachel? Rachel?
Okay, I'm not muted now. Oh, sorry. I'm not even sure. Again, I was just wondering about the question from before, and also, actually, no, never mind. Sorry.
Oh, so you want to pass then?
No,
Okay.
no. I mean, was my question from before, or is that something to wait on?
Okay.
No,
just about the also just a question of how much of the Soviet. I mean, when we talk hearing about Soviet support for the founding of Israel, how much of that is organic? How much of this was? How long had I mean, I guess from the Soviet or even, well, I guess I imagine I can't imagine that the Tsarists were thinking about that, but just how far back in that of including, do you have any sense of what Lenin had any feelings on because he was alive for the beginnings of the Zionist idea for that, and then before Stalin really made it a priority, and just of saying like how that was communicated with the British and others in the founding of that, like how, if for your understanding.
I understand your question. I get it.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm gonna hold them answering that question. Other people can respond to it in their comments, but yeah. Okay, Talmadge, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question for either Rick or John. Is there's part of in terms of the actual purchase of land that the Zionists from the Arabs, there was an understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that part of the ability to seize land was predicated upon the assumption that a lot of Arab landholders were doing this by oral tradition as opposed to written contracts as you would have in Europe. Is that a truth or not? I mean, that's what I've heard, is that land was basically grabbed from people saying, well, they didn't have contracts, and so therefore we're going to take it because it's not really their land. That's what I've been told. So I'm not sure if that's true or if it's a myth or what, and maybe you can help clarify that.
Are either of you able to answer that question quickly, or do you want to wait and do that in your comments? Well, let's come back and have you do it in the comments. That's okay. Yeah, but it's an important question. Ted, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, John. Thank you, Rick. I'm sorry I lost my connection for part of Rick's presentation. So if my questions have already been answered, I just missed that part. So there are two things. First of all, although I'm no expert on this history, I understand that the Ottoman Empire's system of land was not just I mean, what Talmadge described, I think, is more or less correct. And once the British Mandate took over, everything was sort of in the gray zone. And the British favored the powerful traditional leaders who weren't necessarily legal landowners. But correct me if I'm wrong, Rick and John. But also, I think from what I remember from the history I studied 40 years ago, there was an element in the purchases of land that was like the purchases of land by the British from the Native Americans. You know, hey, sell us this land. And if you don't sell it to us, we're going to ask that guy over there to sell it to us. And it's going to be legal. And this is how much we're going to pay you. Okay? Backed by armed force. And so this is what I remember from studying these things in the past. But related to this, I would like John and Rick, one of you at least, to address the formation of the Zionist armed forces in Israel. So where did they get the soldiers? Where did they get the money? Where did they get the arms? How was it that by 1946, they were in a position where they had a monopoly, or at least a huge advantage of armed forces against the Palestinian people or against the Arab population? And I would like to hear that question addressed. And if it was already addressed, I apologize for the question.
Okay. All right. I'm going to call on Henry. Nice to see you, Henry. And you're muted, so you got to unmute yourself, please.
Is that better now?
Yes.
Okay, nice to see you too. I joined very, very late, but I did hear two questions that I want to respond to briefly. One about the position of the Soviet Union and the formation of the Israeli state. The traditional position of the communist movement since the time of Lenin and before was opposition to Zionism and opposition to the whole idea that Jewish people have to get out of Europe and go live somewhere else in order to be safe. The same year that the Zionist organization was formed in Basel in 1897, the Bund was formed in Vilna, and the Bund explicitly opposed Zionism and stood for fighting for socialism and workers' power wherever Jewish workers live. And so there was a very clear, in the same year, two major currents in the Jewish communities in Europe were formed, the Zionist current and the anti-Zionist Bundescurrent. And the Bund, as you know, was one of the forming organizations, one of the constitutional organizations of the original RSDLP, the first Russian Socialist Party, member of the Socialist International, that Second International, which was formed by revolutionary intellectuals and real workers. And the revolutionary intellectuals, their names are all well known, and the real workers were largely Bund workers in the trade unions organized by the Bund. So the traditional socialist position was always opposition to Zionism, and the official position of the Communist International and of the Palestinian Communist Party was always in favor of an independent Palestine, following the principle of the right of self-determination of nations. An independent Palestine would be self-determination for the people of Palestine, whatever their ethnic composition is. Palestine defined as a geographic entity and a political entity, and not as an ethnic or, Arab or Jewish or anything like that. The whole idea of dividing Palestine into two ethnically characterized states was a real huge step backwards in international politics. And the idea of forming a Jewish state and an Arab state by partitioning the country had disastrous consequences, as a similar partition plan had at around the same time in British colonial India. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And of course, the representative of the Palestinian Communist Party signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948, May 15th, 1948. And of course, there was dissension among Palestinian and Jewish communists in Palestine and socialists over that, and there were all kinds of splits and things like that after that. I'll say something about the armed force, the creation of the armed force in Palestine. Very important that Zionists, in other words, early settlers in Palestine, joined the British Army in First World War, joined the British Army as Jewish Zionist settlers in Palestine, joined the British Army in the First World War in order to learn military skills. In Palestine, the British colonial power had a special counterinsurgency force led by an officer named Ord Wingate, who played a major role in the 30s famous Arab rebellion in Palestine, which was an anti-colonial rebellion led by Palestinian Arab nationalists and socialist workers who played a major role in a general strike, a very important general strike in the 30s. So this counterinsurgency force organized by Ord Wingate was also an opportunity for the Zionists to learn military skills, and they joined the Ord Wingate, what was called the night squads of Ord Wingate, and that is basically the genesis of the Israeli special forces that Arik Sharon was part of, and that Barak was part of, and actually Netanyahu's brother, who died in a special operation, was part of. So they really made a point. They understood that the only way that they could dominate Palestine is by having a superior military force, and they made sure to get that training from the British colonial powers until they could oppose the British colonial powers and push them out. And that's the essence. In other words, the Zionists in Palestine understood that there was going to be a military confrontation, and they prepared for it systematically and thoroughly, which the Palestinian nationalists did not, always trusting foreign powers, Arab leaders, diplomacy, and that's led them to the sad position that they're in today. There's lots more to say about that, but I'm going to end now. Thank you for hearing me out. Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay. Yeah, just a reminder, generally we're asking people to keep their comments to 3 minutes, but I thought Henry's comments were really important and useful, so I gave him extra
I hope
time.
I didn't go far beyond
No,
that.
You're fine. You're fine.
And if you would have made some kind of hand signs to me, I would have
it's
respected
okay.
them.
Don't worry about it. Yeah. Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Rick and John, for your presentations. Just a point which was raised about the purchase of land. Certainly, Ilan Pappé in his 10 Myths about Israel covers some of that history, and specifically Ben Gurion making this claim to a British commission that Zionist principles or organizations did not need the Ottoman land titles. The Bible was their land title. So in that very racist statement was that acknowledgement of the degree to which the Ottoman land registry, the TAPU, had actually been in place and has continued to be the basis on which Zionist allocations of land and the registry is built on. And then Ben Gurion himself sort of acknowledges that in his dismissal of the legitimacy of the existing land claims that the Palestinian indigenous population had already established under the Ottoman Empire. So it's really just a comment and other to thank the presenters. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other hands raised. In at least using the Rick, did you want to answer one of the questions?
Well, one thing, significant British and U.S. capital was continuously sent to the Jewish Agency for purchase of land. And while I don't disagree with what people have said overall, they were buying land. In fact, the earliest Zionist immigration to Palestine from the 1880s to about 1915, 16, they bought land and they set up the Moshav system, the quote unquote cooperative system.
Okay, is that it? All right. So just looking at some of the comments in the chat. I'd like to ask Ofer if he has any comments or responses generally to the presentations.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I thought it was very good. Nothing special to add. I mean, it captures what I had to learn by myself, of course, about Zionism, not at school.
Okay. All right. Well, so maybe we should, unless there's anything further, I'd like to just check with anybody who hasn't spoken, anybody that hasn't been here before. Would you like to say anything? Doesn't have to be oh, Ted. Ted, are you? Okay, I guess Ted is leaving. All right. Then I think I'm going to go ahead and call on John and Rick one at a time to just make their summing up comments and remind everybody that if there's an interest in general discussion after they do their concluding comments, we can continue talking because there's plenty of related things to talk about, in particular about the project that we're really serious about, which is how can we unite the current struggles to support Ukraine and Palestine. So in any case, John, do you want to go first with your concluding comments?
Sure, okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank Rick for his comments. And I know he's devoted many, many years of his life to this extremely important issue. And I, although I've read a fair bit about it, but I learned a lot from his comments. I want to comment, well, one thing that really came clear in Rick's presentation is the role of the capitalist class and the landowning class in the role that he explained in Palestine. That's not unique to Palestine. And in fact, that's been the role that the landowning, kind of the feudal landowning aristocracy and budding developing capitalist class, they've been interlinked throughout, they've been really one and the same throughout the former colonial world. And every single time they have played that role of, on the one hand, living in perpetual dread of their own working class, and on the other hand, linking up with the imperialists, whoever those imperialist powers happen to be. That was true back 100 years ago, and it's still true today. And I think that my own personal view is that that's what the theory of permanent revolution explains, is exactly that process. On the question of the role of the Soviet Union, there had been one left Zionist party, the Palestinian Zionists, they were called, that actually sought to join the Third International, the Communist International. And there was a series of negotiations over a period of time, but the Third International took the position that Zionism was totally incompatible with socialism, and ultimately they were refused to join. And you could see Zion later on within Israel, within Palestine, continually tried to square the circle. They were one of those two parties that I had mentioned that always was trying to make labor Zionism into something pro-worker, which it never could be. And they refused to really make a break with the Histadrut. So they played a bridge between some of the desires of Jewish workers in Palestine for working class unity, a bridge between that and Jewish supremacy, in other words, Zionism. And as far as the Soviet Union, then what happened was, and this is an issue that really has to be discussed and studied further, is what happened in the Soviet Union? Why did that revolution degenerate? And then in 1948, where the Soviet Union had always opposed Jewish state and Zionism, under Stalin, they turned right around. Stalin, basically, in my opinion, he took the view that an independent Israel would undercut British imperialism, and therefore was in the interest of the Soviet bureaucracy. And as far as the masses of the Palestinian people, their interests, their role was just to serve the interests of the Soviet bureaucracy. And that was their view. That was the view of Stalin all throughout his career. And that is still the view of many, many people on the left who today, who, for instance, oppose, don't support Ukraine, and also don't support the people of Syria. So those would be those are the main points that I would raise in summary. That's it, Cheryl. You're muted, Cheryl.
Cheryl.
You're muted, Cheryl.
Yes, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I got it. I got it. Linda, do you have a question? Because they're doing their summaries.
Yeah,
okay.
I don't have much of a question. One of the things that really struck me was it sounds really trivial, but the thing about the benches before the Wailing Wall, I mean, that reminded me so much of how the anti-choice movement fights. You know, the way they they do these really petty things to try and bully people, into a fight. And it seems like one of the things we could do from studying, one of the things we could learn from studying this whole issue is how movements without any mass support manage to wage a struggle. And it's not, like I said, their tactics. It was like a lot of their tactics are very fascistic, and that's another movement without mass support usually, although eventually it gets mass support. But I don't know, that was just the one thing that hasn't been mentioned that I really noticed. And it just kind of struck a chord.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm a little not quite sure how to proceed here. Talmadge,
Yes.
yeah, we had called on
Okay.
yeah, okay. Talmadge, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was watching the live demonstration. I think it was in DC yesterday, I believe, on Palestine. And I did notice that somebody was carrying a Ukrainian flag in the demonstration. I just saw it for a brief moment, and maybe other people saw it as well. But there obviously somebody or a group of people were definitely making the link in that demonstration. So that's all I really wanted to say.
Okay. All right. Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
I want to try to answer some of those outstanding questions, but first I want to really thank you, Henry, for your comments about how the Zionists gained military knowledge. And one point that I dropped out of my presentation was that in 1944, the ardent Zionist and consummate racist Winston Churchill established a Zionist brigade ostensibly to fight the Nazis at the end of the war, but of course didn't and wouldn't. It was for later. He knew what was coming. He wasn't a fool. And they did. And they were vicious and brutal. Another point that I dropped out was the behavior of the British. Everything that they'd done to the Irish for a couple hundred years, they brought into Palestine and used against the Palestinians. When Palestinians in the hills attacked the railroads, the British tied Palestinians to the front of the trains, just like they did the Irish, so that the indigenous people would not attack the trains. It didn't stop them. It may have stopped a few, but in the main, it didn't. The other main point that I forgot, and it's the worst thing that I forgot, was that when the general strike was broken by the British and the Zionists, who created a special police force of 12,000 men to help to break the general strike in 1937. The armed struggle was going on in the slums and in the hills already. The British were able to pick people off because of how the rural people dressed compared to how the urban people dressed. So a call went out from the guerrilla movement that everyone, meaning men, should wear the keffiyeh over their heads and offer, you'll help me, there's a cord that ties around the keffiyeh to keep it on the head, and it has a particular name which I have now forgotten.
I think it's called akal, the black ring.
Yes, thank you, Offer. And everyone was ordered to wear that. So it meant that the rural guerrillas could then come into the cities, and the British could not distinguish between them and the urban dwellers. So this is how they moved the post. It's how they exchanged money between urban and countryside, how they got doctors from the cities into the country, et cetera, et cetera. It's a self-reliant movement, and it's extremely important. I wanted to deal with Rachel's question, which I thought was extraordinarily important. I read this in my research that Stalin subjectively believed that a new Israeli state would be socialist. How in the hell you arrive at such a bizarre, idealistic conclusion is beyond me. But with Stalin, all things were possible simultaneously. The other dynamic is the racism, is Stalin's racism. And we shouldn't discard that and shouldn't diminish it. The hatred, he had a hatred for Jews. He was very anti-Semitic, and he was very racist toward non-Russian peoples. And we can see that the moment that the former Soviet Union imploded, because all those racist feelings came flooding out. And if you are actually fighting capitalist ideology in your country, then it'll be defeated, and you won't have those ideas among the people. And so it's why today we have so many Russian citizens who kind of just arbitrarily say that Ukrainians are subhuman, that they don't exist, that they're all Nazis, because you can easily turn them into the other. As for Nina's point about Ukrainians being pro-Israel, yes, there's a portion of the population, some who are Jewish, many who are not, who are pro-Israel. But there are far more who are pro-Palestinian, because Palestinians during the period between 48 and even beyond 67 came to study in Ukraine and built ties. And Ukraine, as part of the former Soviet Union, was pro-Palestinian and had major delegations of the Palestine Liberation Organization housed in Kharkiv and in Kyiv and in Odessa. And so the Ukrainian people built up strong fraternal ties with Palestinian people. And the nationalist feelings on the part of many Ukrainians and the nationalist feelings of many Palestinians commingled together. And just another quick point about that, if we look at the votes in the United Nations on 4 more recent resolutions dealing with Israel, Ukraine voted against Israel and voted with the Palestinians who had put up those resolutions. So if they're very pro-Israel as a state, then you'd expect them to be pro-Israel in international diplomatic surroundings, which they have not. Zelensky is a Zionist, and he remains a Zionist. But Zelensky is one person, not the entire people, the entire population. Just one more comment. I did 80 hours of research for this talk, and I have storyboards in front of me. And I was finishing last night at 12:30, and I did the presentation through a voice memo, and I realized I had 2 hours of material. It's a lesson for better organization on my part, and next week I hopefully will deliver better organization in the material. But it is so vast. There's just so much that has been historically suppressed about the Palestinian people and about how their struggle and their ability to organize and the vast array of oppressive and repressive and suppressive mechanisms that they faced then and that they face now. And I will also prepare a bibliography and I will send that to Cheryl so that people can begin to read on their own the vast library. So you can become knowledgeable, and you can make other people knowledgeable. And that's how we win best, when people have the knowledge that they see through the lies, and that they transform and they become revolutionaries, so that we can destroy this vicious, rotten system. And with that, I say adieu. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Cheryl, I'd just like to break in for 1 minute here. There was, some of you know, there was a problem with the registrations. If you registered prior to last night, please re-register, or else send me or post here your email address so that we can make sure to include you in the future parts of this series.
Yeah, that's really important. So yeah, again, just a reminder. So the next forum is next Sunday, same time, same place. And we're gonna have to figure out how to, get the information out about that. People will have to re-register. And again, the forum after that is on February 4th. Losing my voice here. So should we close this meeting out? Or do people want to hang around and chat for a while? Jeff had posted something in the comments, which I thought was really that the pro-Palestine movement itself is really opposed to it is not in solidarity with Ukraine. We can talk about Ukrainians in Palestine, but we need to talk about the movement in solidarity with Palestine itself, which is really problematic. It's the leadership is dominated by people who are basically pro-Putinists. And that is one of the biggest challenges we're dealing with. Linda, go ahead.
Let me make sure I have my that's the subject that we probably should have started with, or at some point. Since this is a 3-part series, I'm sure we're going to get to it. But the whole issue of colonial settler states, and the kind of aggression that Ukraine has been subjected to is very reminiscent and takes part under an identical system that the Palestinians are from Israel. And it's it's a confusing ue, but we really need to. That's what we're really trying to educate people about, is that solidarity with Ukraine also means, looking at the struggles of Syrians against Assad and Putin, the struggles of the Palestinians and Uyghurs and other national liberation struggles that are not fighting U.S. imperialism per se, but they're struggling against sub-imperialism. Well, Israel's a client state of the U.S., but all these other would-be imperialist powers that have arisen since the fall of the Soviet Union. And and there are many, and there's also many, there's a socialist tradition in Ukraine that has been denigrated and ignored by the Putinist left here, and they have come out with many statements in solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian struggle, which we should probably do more to publicize on this series. And that's all I have to say.
Can I just quickly mention one book that I think that people should go and buy and read?
Sure.
It's by what's his first name? Khalife. 100 years of. Now I'll just put it up for next week. I can't remember the title now, but John, the one that John put up by Zachary Lachman, Comrades and Enemies. That is an excellent book. It's outstanding. It really is. And a lot of the long time pro-Palestinian intellectuals, people like Joel Bennett at Stanford, who's gotten a little squishy, are now constantly quoting Lockman. That's how important the book is. It addresses a lot of important issues. By itself, it's not. If you just read that book, it'll help you a lot, but it won't answer all the questions. Somebody mentioned earlier Ilan Pappé's 10 Myths About Zionism. That's outstanding. Wonderful book. Norman Finkelstein's book about the Holocaust, how the Zionists have made the Holocaust private property, is one of the best books I have ever read in my life. You know, he's kind of fallen off the earth, but that book is just so very, very important. Cadence Novak asked a question in the chat. How do we build solidarity? A very important question, which hopefully we'll get to later. But in general, again, education. We have to tell people, we have to explain history to people. We have to break the stranglehold that the imperialists, the global imperialists, have made surrounding all kinds of questions, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's women's oppression. They all go together, and education is the key. Because once you know inside that you have the truth, then you look to gain more knowledge. You look to explain to other people what is going on. That's how we build a movement. And I want to thank people for coming today. Really appreciate it.
So,
John, go ahead.
So first of all, this is the book, and that Rick mentioned, and that I drew on heavily in my presentation, and it focuses on labor Zionism and the struggle within the relationships between Arab and Jewish workers and the labor movement. And as such, it takes a particular, just one aspect of that whole history, but in my opinion, it's a central aspect. I wanted to, first of all, was there any people, if you are in this forum now and you registered prior to last night, if you could just put a note in the chat. I'm trying to figure out who, what happened with the registration. I want to make one comment about, also, we talked about Ukraine and how many of the people in the pro-Palestine movement don't support, maybe even most of them don't support Ukraine. Well, it's even more kind of hypocritical in that they don't support the Syrian struggle. Many of them don't, and we should remember that, and it flows from the same method of thinking, which is the method of thinking that I mentioned. We're just, anything that the U.S. government says or does, we're against, and so, and even that, well, really what it is the inheritors of the Soviet Union, which is this horrific reactionary capitalist regime in Russia today. We support them. That's what it really is. Yesterday, I was at a rally for Palestine. Well, they shut down the Oakland port again, and there was a truck that was parading around that was central to the rally that had this big sign on it. I actually took a picture. I'll try to post it if I can. On one side, it had this slogan about the U.S., Britain, and Israel are the axis of evil. nothing about the role of Russia or China for that matter. And then on the back, it had something against Russophobia. So this is quite prevalent in the pro-Palestine movement. And I think that there are a lot of people who just are not really aware of it, don't understand what's behind it. And as Rick said, we have to bring the actual facts, the history, and the conclusions that are drawn from the actual history. We have to bring that into the movement as participants in the struggle for Palestinian rights, but also to broaden it out a little bit.
Can I just mention this book?
Okay, but then I'm going to call on Megan. Go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead.
The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism by Rashid, that's Rashid, Khalidi, Khalidi. And his family is historically one of the urban elite. The Khalidis were under the Ottomans, were the scholars and the administrators for the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. He is a professor at Columbia University. He holds the Edward Said Chair. He is a phenomenal historian.
Megan, go ahead.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, John and Rick, for your presentations. They were great. I appreciate a little bit of time has lagged, so I hope this still lands well. I wanted to respond to the question by Cadence about building solidarity. So I wanted to kind of build on the response that was given around education, which is, of course, 100% accurate. I also wanted to add to the conversation that let us not forget that the basis of solidarity is also relationship building. And so, you know, it's hard to build solidarity if you say, don't know a single Palestinian person, right? It's like we have an obligation to not be sitting at home and not talking to people outside of our small particular worlds. We have a huge obligation to go and get out of our spaces and into other spaces and into dialogue and into relationship with people, right? And I say this as someone who is a, you know, like a white European heritage colonial settler in the United States who is not Syrian, who is not Muslim. And I, in 2016, stepped out of my small particular world and joined the Syria Solidarity movement because I did not understand the Syrian context. And so for what has now been, at the time it was like I joined very late in the game, but what has now been like 8 years is I began to be in conversation and to be listening to Syrian people on the ground in diaspora and their experiences. And a solidarity has grown through that. And that is what also inspired me to be involved in and in dialogue in the situation in Ukraine with Putin's invasion, et cetera. And so just want to make sure that that isn't lost in this, that it's not just reading books. It is also very much based on building actual human relationships and like the material reality of mutual aid and showing up in each other's spaces, cultural exchange, all this other stuff. So I hope that we can make sure that that's a part of this as well. Thank you.
Good point. So we're gonna gather all of these various resources that people are suggesting, one way or the other, books and videos, and we will find a way to put them together in a cohesive document and make that available.
Here, Rick describes what he will be discussing in part 2 of this series.
Everybody smiles. I'm going to go, basically, I stopped at 1950. I had to. Initially, it was going to be from 1957 to around 1990. I may modify that slightly because we have in part 3, we have Afar and Hamada, who's a Palestinian who lives in the old city, are speaking. And a lot of the stuff, Hamada's talk is going to talk a lot about from like Oslo forward. So I was going to go just before Oslo. There's so much to get in there, though. I may have to pare it down slightly and move a lot faster. Because I'm only presenting, I figure I have a half an hour with the blessing of the chairs. And I'll have to be much tighter. I recognize that. So that's basically the presentation. So
Okay.
it's what the Zionists have. It's what the Zionist state of Israel has done in the period, and the Palestinian response. So you have the formation of the PLO, you have Fatah, you have all the organizations that sit outside of occupied Palestine. Then you have 1967. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on. It's more contemporary history.